Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire supported by Glenlivet Books. Has the government mishandled its response to the Taliban takeover of Kabul? And as a result, has it failed to act in ways that could be beneficial to India's interests? That's the view of my guest today, former Foreign Secretary and former Secretary General of the Commonwealth, Krishnan Srinivasan. Mr. Srinivasan, let's start with what you said to the Times of India in Calcutta yesterday. You believe India should start a dialogue with the Taliban. Tell me, why do you believe that is the right course of action at this moment of turmoil?
Well, we've been informed that there has already been a connection between the Indian government and the Taliban. We're not sure where, we're not sure when, but and at what level, but we've got this on reasonably authoritative sources from the Gulf. I think it's not a question of starting a dialogue, it's a question of resuming that dialogue, especially in the present circumstances, when both sides need to understand each other's expectations and intentions so that there's sufficient clarity to chart a proper course forward in the relationship.
Tell me this. I can understand why you believe India should talk to the Taliban, but why should the Taliban want to talk to India? After all, it's now well established that Sher Mohammad Stanikzai sent a message to the Indians to say, keep your mission open, don't remove your ambassador and diplomats. And we disregarded that message. And in the process, what we communicated to the Taliban is we do not trust your promises of protection to our mission. Having snubbed them, why would the Taliban want to talk to India?
Yes, we don't really know why Stanikzai's advice was not taken. We don't really have enough information at our disposal to make a judgment on that. I think that it would be reasonable, however, to expect the Taliban to respond to an approach from India for the resumption of that dialogue. Because I think that it's generally accepted that the Taliban wish to have the widest possible degree of international recognition. And if they do not persuade India to have a reasonable relationship with them, it is a huge lacuna. Afghanistan is a South Asian country. It's as much a South Asian country as it is a Central Asian country. Historically, its ties with South Asia have been extremely strong. It's a member of SAARC. India is the leading country by far in SAARC in terms of economic strength, in terms of the power of its armed forces, and the power of its historic institutions. So I can understand that the Taliban has everything to gain in picking up the threads of this discussion. I would be extremely surprised if they don't react to an offer from India for a proper dialogue.
Let me put to you two concerns that might be in the mind of the Indian government at this moment. First of all, the Indian government will remember the manner in which the Taliban humiliated the country during the 1999 hijack. They will also remember the attacks on the Indian mission in Kabul, at least on two separate occasions, which were carried out by Sirajuddin Haqqani and the Haqqani group, who are now the number 2 in the Taliban. And at the moment, the Haqqani brothers, both Khalil and Anas, are actually in Kabul playing leading roles. All of that will make the Indian government believe this is not the right time to talk. We need clarity about who controls the Taliban and their intentions. Therefore, it's wiser to wait rather than reach out. How do you respond to that?
Yes, I mean, there is an argument which suggests that it might be better now to hang on, wait on developments, and then take a view about the situation in Afghanistan. I'm not asking for trust. I'm not suggesting we wait for trust. I'm suggesting that nothing is lost by having a discussion with the Taliban on expectations and intentions so that we have a certain degree of clarity. I'm also suggesting that the Taliban has, despite its record, of which we are properly suspicious, and have great misgivings over, we have to accept that that most of the, in fact, all of the regional countries are in touch with the Taliban. They are all in Kabul. And I think that it would be reasonable to expect the Taliban also to respond to an approach from India, at least to clarify the situation, which is a little confused, but is getting more resolved in Kabul with the appointment of a certain personages in the administration and so on. I fear that if we wait on events too long, we then will miss being in the front line or in the first rank of countries to have to strike a relationship with the Taliban, which could be of advantage to India.
Let me put to you a second concern. The Taliban will be under a lot of pressure from Pakistan to keep India at arm's distance. Not that long ago, Pakistan's Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi told Tolo television in Kabul that India has a larger role than it ought to have in Afghanistan. And Mr. Qureshi has been in Kabul for the last 2 days. Surely, that is another reason why Taliban would hesitate to talk to India. They would not at this early stage want to offend a country that has been their prime support for the last 20 years.
That is all true. I think we can expect Pakistan to play a blocking game as far as we are concerned. But let us also give the Taliban a certain degree of credit for knowing what their own self-interest is. I remember when the Soviet Union intervened in Afghanistan in 1980, the entire UN General Assembly hung on the words of the Indian permanent representative and waited to hear what he would say. I think the same situation in a way arises now. The whole world will be interested to know what India says about Afghanistan. India is a very, very critical factor in Afghanistan for a huge number of reasons. And I cannot believe the Taliban will not appreciate that fact. Irrespective of what the Pakistanis inform them, I would expect the Taliban to pursue their self-interest, at least to this extent.
Let me then raise a practical problem. How do we actually have a dialogue with the Taliban? We're not in Kabul. We're not in contact with the Taliban either in Qatar or Pakistan. And even our friends on the ground in Afghanistan, the Americans, the British, and the French, aren't in any position to help us. So how do you get over that practical problem that we're not in touch? How do we therefore have a dialogue?
I'm sure that the Indian government has methods of communicating with the Taliban directly. I think that we don't need to have any cloak and dagger activity like that of William J. Burns flying into Kabul. I think that we have enough channels open to be able to make contact at the appropriate levels with Baradar or whoever else. I also agree with you entirely that the countries you mentioned would not serve as good interlocutors, and I don't think we should go down that route at all. I'm very happy that Prime Minister Mr. Modi has had a longish conversation with the President of Russia, Mr. Putin. I think they have an embassy which is open and functioning in Kabul. They have contacts with the authorities of the Taliban in Kabul. There is also Iran, of course, and I think these two countries with whom we have very good relations would be better interlocutors. The best, of course, however, is a direct contact and reopening the lines that we've had already. We have no knowledge of those lines, but we can well assume that they are there.
Let me just pick up on that point. This is the second or third time in this interview you referred to the earlier contacts that India established with the Taliban. You said authoritatively Gulf sources have confirmed these contacts happened, but we don't know with whom or when. How confident are you that these contacts did take place. The Indian government has neither confirmed nor denied them. We have only two sources for saying they happened. One is Al-Qahtani, the special envoy of the Qatar government. And the second is, of course, Sohail Sood Shaheen, the Qatar-based spokesman of the Taliban, who said so to the London paper, The Times. For you, are those sufficient grounds for believing that there were contacts and therefore on that basis they can be resumed? Are you comfortable with that?
Yes, I would frankly assume so. I don't think these reports were based on figments of imagination or speculation. I think they were very real, and I'm pretty confident. I agree with you that we have no basic information on this point. But even assuming that there were no contacts at all in the past, I'm fairly sure that the government of India would know how to reach out to the Taliban, either in Kabul or in Doha or anywhere else. I don't have any misgivings on that point.
So to sum up this,
as I mentioned earlier, if I may, there are always, as a fallback resort, there are always the Russians and Iranians.
To sum up this part of the interview before we move on, you believe India has the capacity to resume a dialogue that was happening earlier, assuming it was, or to restart one, even if it wasn't happening earlier. And then the third fallback is to use friends like Russia and Iran as interlocutors, because they have embassies that they've maintained in the city, not just in the airport.
Yes, I completely agree. I think that's a very good summary of what I do believe. And I have no reason to doubt this.
Let me then move on. If you believe it is important and critical for India to have a dialogue with Taliban at this stage, does it not follow that India made a serious error in withdrawing its ambassador and its diplomats and effectively shutting down its mission 10 days ago on the 16th of August?
Well, I don't think there's any doubt that it's better to be there than to be looking in from outside. I also believe that we have inadequate information as to why the embassy was evacuated. You'll remember that just a few days before the 16th, when the evacuation took place, we were told by the government of India there were no plans to close the mission. Obviously, since that first statement and the time of the evacuation, circumstances changed. We don't have any information about that. We were told, we've been told variously that the mission was under surveillance by the Taliban. We were told that the Taliban had intruded into the visa processing office, which I think has no diplomatic immunity since it's an outsourced activity. We were told that there was a chaotic situation in Afghanistan, certainly in Kabul, that is true. And we were also told that there was a threat from some sources, some malign body, could have been Jaish, could have been the Islamic State, perhaps the Haqqani, but we were never given any detail. So we don't really know the basis on what facts or speculations or warnings through intelligence that the government of India had in order to very rapidly close the mission against its own view of a few days earlier. Without that information, it's very difficult to avoid the conclusion that it was not a wise step, because for one or two other reasons. The other regional countries are in Afghanistan. Many of the countries which were combatants against the Taliban have still maintained their missions in Afghanistan, though they've moved them to more secure locations. That was not a maneuver that I would have recommended in any case. But we must remember that our missions have been operational in many countries where there are very acute dangers. There are missions I can think of, without mentioning the countries concerned, which are in range of rocket and missile possible attacks. There are countries where there is a great threat of civil disorder, including violence, and we've maintained those missions. I remember that at the time of the Chinese Cultural Revolution, when the Indian embassy was a definite hostile entity as far as the Red Guards were concerned. And when some of our diplomats were in fact physically roughed up, we maintained our mission. We never thought of closing it. The Kabul embassy, I don't have any personal knowledge of it of late, but the Kabul embassy is supposed to be one of our best guarded diplomatic missions in the world. And I think that the threat, therefore, threat perception must have been a very acute one in order to have evacuated the mission. But as I say, without that information, I think it's very difficult on the face of it to draw the conclusion that, not to draw the conclusion that it was precipitate and a mistake. We do not also know what steps have been taken to safeguard the premises. Has another country been entrusted with looking after the premises? Is there any watch and ward which has been left behind in this premises? In fact, our knowledge of the detail of this is very sketchy. So given that, absent that information, I think that all I can say is that I think that it was a misstep to have closed the mission.
You called it precipitate and a mistake. Earlier, you said it was not a wise step. Yesterday, talking to the Times of India in Calcutta, you said it was a serious error. Do you stand by that phrase as well?
Well, this is a question of semantics. All of them add up to the same thing. I think we have lost an advantage. I think the government of India certainly is responsible for the safety and security of its personnel, its official personnel in any country. They obviously placed safety before strategic advantage. Now, we don't know the reason for this, but because that hasn't ever been explained to us. But for want of that information, you can call it whatever you like, anything from a misstep to a serious error. But I think these words embrace the same idea, which I think that it would have been much better for us to be there in looking on first-hand at events than from outside looking looking at Afghanistan from without.
Now, on Monday, that's just 48 hours ago, both the Times of India and the Hindustan Times reported that, in fact, the Indian government has sent a small team of officials comprising Defense Ministry officials and External Affairs Ministry officials who will be stationed at Kabul airport and will seek the assistance of the Americans and possibly NATO countries as well to help secure the evacuation of Indian citizens. Does that indicate to you that having precipitately withdrawn its own diplomats and effectively shut down its mission, the Indian government is now having second thoughts and trying to find a way of getting back a presence, even if it's only limitedly at Kabul airport?
Yes, I think so. As far as I understand, some 80,000, I could be wrong here. I think the figure escapes me. I think thousands of people have been evacuated by India. We are greatly expert at evacuation. Unfortunately, we've had to do this in recent years in Yemen and Libya. I am not at all surprised that we had to move people back for this purpose, for facilitation, because without any facilitation on the ground, this becomes almost an impossible exercise, and you have to leave it to others completely. We've already had to seek the help of, as you say, the United States, maybe some other countries who control the airport, the air traffic control. I think that it is a pity, with the resources at our disposal, the assets of the most important, biggest, most powerful country in South Asia, that we haven't been able to discuss or negotiate, call it what you like, with the Taliban in order to maintain a separate, discrete presence in Kabul for evacuation purposes. I understand the difficulties when the airport is in the hands of another country, but perhaps at least um, Indian contingent of some kind, I'm using contingent not necessarily in a military sense, could have been there outside the airport helping.
Can I interrupt? Would you accept? Can I interrupt? Would you accept that the fact that we had to send back a small contingent to operate out of the airport literally 9 days after shutting down the mission and withdrawing diplomats is a sign that the government realized that the withdrawal that happened on the 16th was precipitate and a mistake, and we need to find a way of ensuring we have a presence? Is this, in a sense, an indication of a mistake without admitting it up front?
Well, I think that all previous experience shows that we could not have done this evacuation of our citizens and visa holders without the presence of some facilitators in Kabul. So it was a natural consequence of having withdrawn the embassy that we would have to send people back. I think there was an air of inevitability about it.
Tell me this time round, with our small contingent present at Kabul airport, they are dependent upon, indeed they need the help of the Americans for sure, but possibly NATO countries as well, to evacuate India's own citizens. Is that a little embarrassing for a country that considers itself a regional
let's just
leader?
let's just say it's paradoxical that, as I said, with all the assets and resources at our disposal, with our tremendous experience at evacuations, not only of Indians, but other citizens from other parts of the world, much further than Afghanistan, we would have placed ourselves in this situation. I think it was inevitable that we would have had to send back a detail of facilitators. I don't know. I doubt whether this was done after consultation with the Taliban. I just would like to repeat that I would have liked to have seen some of these facilitators outside the airport premises also, and without needing the security cover of countries not in the region. Because I think that it's paradoxical that a country like India, very much the major country with resources in the region, was left to play, let us say, a very secondary role.
Now, yesterday's Times of India reports that 6 countries, they are the United States, the United Kingdom, the UAE, France, Germany, and Qatar, have agreed to take Indian citizens working for them in Kabul to their own countries, and India will then later on bring them back to India. What do you make of that?
Well, again, do we have enough knowledge on this? Do we know whether India was consulted on this? Do we know whether the Indian nationals who apparently worked for those countries preferred to take a very roundabout route to get back to India?
Can I interrupt? Can I interrupt at that point? I'll quote to you the language used by the Times of India. The paper says these 6 countries agreed to take Indian citizens to their countries. Now, when you agree to something, you're clearly responding to a request. Otherwise, you're offering to do so. That language, that word agreed, suggests that they were approached by the Indian government and agreed to a request.
Well, maybe I'm looking at it in the most favorable sense, but possibly that agreement was between those countries and the citizens of India who worked for them. I'm just assuming, because it's possible that those citizens felt that they might have employment opportunities, continued employment opportunities in those countries that you mentioned before they came back to India, or as an alternative to coming back to India. We can't tell whether the agreement was actually between those countries and the citizens or between those countries and India. Let's look at it from your point of view, that your suggestion that they were, let us say, facilitated in this decision by the government of India? Well, I think that this suggests a couple of things, that India perhaps doesn't have the capacity right now to evacuate every one of its citizens, so they're quite happy to take the help of third countries. And secondly, perhaps also they feel that the employing countries, the employers, have some responsibilities. And if they are, if the Indian employees are taken to the countries of the employers, that the Indian government will then be happy to pick them up from there. I find it a little odd, though, that that this very roundabout route should have been perhaps suggested, because some of those countries that you mentioned are really way off the beaten track. So there must have been, I imagine, we have inadequate knowledge, but but on the face of it, it's a little surprising, especially since the Indian government is evacuating its own citizens reasonably expeditiously from Kabul. We haven't had any complaints so far about the deadline of the 31st. So we assume that the evacuation is well underway. But
Well,
it's possible, as I said.
Can I interrupt again? There has been a similar sort of development, and I emphasize those words, similar sort of development, because it's reported that perhaps as many as 200 Afghan Sikhs and Hindus, I emphasize they're Afghan, have actually chosen not to be evacuated to India because they believe that they have a chance of being evacuated to Canada instead. That's in the papers, and that's one of the holdups. They are now hoping that they can go to Canada, where they think they will have opportunities for jobs that are easier and better. In India, they may not even get official refugee status. So it's not an identical situation, but it's not that dissimilar either. Let me move on. We're coming to the end of this interview. Do you believe that the Indian government has mishandled the response to the Taliban takeover? And do you believe that there were things that it could have done and should have done that would have been of much more benefit to India's interests?
I think that it's hard to avoid the conclusion that they took the first steps in some degree of haste. As I say, we don't have information as to the threat and the threat perception there, but assuming that the threat was not an extremely grave one, and one that could not have been handled by the defense perimeter that we had in Kabul, then I think that, frankly, it seemed to me that we've lost the advantage of location, and we placed the safety of personnel over the possibilities of strategic advantage in being there.
And you believe placing the safety of personnel over the strategic advantage of being there in these circumstances was the wrong judgment call?
If the threat perception was not one that required such an evacuation at very short notice, yes, I would say that.
My last question, what message does this send to the Afghan people? I'm not talking now of the Taliban, but to the Afghan people, the citizens of that country. We believe that there is an intimate bond of history and culture that binds us together. We've done a lot in the last 20 years to try and secure that. What message now have we sent to them at this point of time?
Yes, I think that over the past 20 years, as you very correctly said, we have cemented the historic ties between the peoples of Afghanistan and India, and I think very successfully. I think that with reasonable claim and justification, the view that the Indians are the best friends of Afghanistan is credible, and I think that it's been accepted widely that India has a disinterested concern about the welfare of Afghans. So in many ways, this is the most important question which you've raised. I think it's a shame when Afghanistan appears to require all manner of assistance, when the funding from international agencies has been choked off, when there are murmurs of sanctions from the West which will add to the distress of the Afghan people, when the World Food Programme says there's an acute shortage of food and likely to be severe problems of hunger there. And of course, the health situation also is in a very difficult situation, difficult state. I think it's a great shame that India's flag is not flying in Afghanistan. I think it would have given some comfort to the Afghan people, whom we respect and admire and stand with in their moment of difficulty. But I think that taking the mission out would only have given satisfaction to those who don't wish us well in Afghanistan. And this does not include the Afghan people, which you mentioned. But I think that let me also say that I hope that that the withdrawal of the mission is not irrevocable. I hope that it will require, obviously, the approval of the authorities in Kabul, call them again what you like, the regime, the agency, whatever. But those in control in Kabul would need to be approached here. But I hope that the mission could be reopened in the shortest
very,
possible.
very quickly, because you're saying something very important right at the end. So I need you to give me a very brief answer. You're suggesting that if and when, and I'm using those words deliberately, if and when India decides to reopen the mission, we will need the approval of the authorities in Kabul. And that means the Taliban government. We can't simply take a plane, arrive in Kabul, unlock the door and get on. We need Taliban approval.
Well, I wish what you suggested might be possible, but I don't think so. In practical terms, you have closed the mission. And I think to reopen the mission with diplomatic facilities, with security for our personnel there, and with the ability to function normally, you will need the, well, if not the permission, you'll need the facilitation of the local authority, which clearly is now the Taliban.
Mr. Srinivasan, thank you very much for this interview. Take care. Stay safe.
Thank you.